Hi guys! In the last few weeks I read quite a bit of crime fiction, so I thought I'd make a themed wrap-up of at least those books that I have something to talk about. So that makes 4 books, or 4.5 if we count my current read, which I'm going to talk about a bit at the end of the video. So let's get the bad apple of the bunch out of the way first, shall we? And I'm afraid to say that was The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett. This is of course an absolute classic and the most famous book in Dashiell Hammett's Sam Spade series about this private investigator Sam Spade in San Francisco. And in this novel, Sam Spade is hired by a damsel in distress who asks him to find her sister and the man with whom she eloped. But it becomes very clear very soon that this elopement is completely fictitious, and the woman has asked Sam Spade to find this man for completely different reasons, and it is the beginning of a wild goose chase. Since this is an older novel, it's from 1930, and since it's from the so-called hard-boiled genre, I expected it and the main character to be rather machista in this deceptive, gentlemanly fashion. However, I was not prepared whatsoever for how ridiculously high the degree of machismo and sexism in this novel is. And the problem with that is that nowhere in the text is that marked, that machismo. It's nowhere marked in any way as something negative or at the very least amusing. On the contrary, it is quite clear that the reader, whom the novel obviously imagines as a male reader, is supposed to admire Sam Spade for it, for what a cool dude he is, you know. And while that is of course also often the case in old novels, again, the degree to which it is the case in this one is just through the roof. And on top of that, the writing is embarrassingly clumsy and repetitive. Each and every person that Sam Spade meets on this wild goose chase is introduced in exactly the same boring way, and the mystery is developed in such a boring fashion, and the female lead, female main character, if you want to call her that, who could have been used to introduce some interesting elements of surprise into the plot, was just an onlooker on the sidelines. At first you think that her meekness is all an act, and at one point she will pull off her mask and reveal herself to be this tough schemer who has been pulling the strings in the background the whole time, a bit like, you know who, from the TV series Elementary, you know. But it never happens, and all the time it's just Sam Spade running around and arguing with one shady guy after another until the whole thing is finally over, which takes a surprisingly, exasperatingly long time for such a slim novel. I am nonplussed, honestly, that this has become and is still considered to be such a classic. I can accept the idea of people enjoying this in the 1930s, 40s, maybe 50s. But how on earth has this survived beyond those decades? It's a complete mystery to me. And after that I read another classic, but I get the feeling that this is a rather obscure one. But perhaps I just think that because of my limited exposure to classic crime fiction. The book is Fadeout by Joseph Hansen, and it is the first book in his Dave Brandstetter series. Dave Brandstetter is an investigator for an insurance company, and he makes sure that people who are reported dead or declared dead by the police are in fact really dead and not just missing or even hiding, so that their relatives can claim their life insurance money. Brandstetter lives in San Francisco, but this first book takes place mainly in rural California, and there a middle-aged man has gone missing. His car was found beside a gully that was flooded during recent heavy rainfall, and he is presumed to have drowned, and the police have declared him dead. And Brandstetter now has to talk his way through what seems like half the small town where the man lived, to reconstruct events and to find out what happened to the man on the day in question. So the book is mainly just Brandstetter talking to people, but it is short enough and the people are interesting and diverse enough that it doesn't become tedious. We also get some glimpses into Brandstetter's private life, which is undergoing a major upheaval, but that is all mostly in the background and never overwhelms the main mystery plot. So to be clear, this is not romantic suspense, but sexuality does play a big role in the book and the series as a whole, I assume, because Dave Brandstetter is gay. Not always openly so, because this is set in 1969 when the book was also written, but he is always comfortably gay. On the Goodreads page for this book, the first thing you'll read before the synopsis is a quote from a review in the New York Times that says, "After 40 years, Hammett has a worthy successor." And I think that this quote is so misleading because Dave Brandstetter is nothing like Sam Spade. There is a superficial similarity in that Dave Brandstetter also has this hard-boiled look to him and he carries himself in the same way. But that is it. Beyond that, there is nothing machista about him, and he treats people very carefully and compassionately, unlike Sam Spade, who is extremely arrogant. And even though Brandstetter works for a private company, and one at that as an insurance company makes money directly out of people's fears and insecurities, despite that, it almost seems like he underwent ethical instructions and sensibility training of a contemporary policeman. But he's not just professional, but he seems to be genuinely compassionate as a person, and he demonstrates that several times in the course of the story. And then the second difference between Hammett and Hansen is that Hansen writes smoothly and naturally. Writing 4 decades later, his narrative style is much more modern. I really don't know what the New York Times reviewer was thinking when he wrote that these two are comparable. I do know that I enjoyed Fadeout a lot, and I've already downloaded the second volume in the series, which is called Death Claims. And I think it's going to be a very interesting series about San Francisco and California in the 1970s. And then I read A Litter of Bones by J.D. Kirk, and this is the first book in a series of police procedurals set in the Scottish Highlands. And in this first book, a Glasgow detective is sent to Fort William to help them with a case there that has disturbing similarities to an old closed case from Glasgow. It was the case of a serial kidnapper who kidnapped several young children and held them captive for a few days before he killed them. And now the exact same thing has happened again in Fort William, down to several details that were never disclosed to the public and should not be known to anybody except for the police, of course, and the killer. But the thing is, the killer was found and is in prison. Then again, the killer sustained a head wound when he tried to flee during arrest and has basically been out of it ever since. So, what I liked about the book is the setting and the description of it, the Highland small town charm, because Fort William might be the biggest place in a radius of 100 miles, but it's still tiny. And its small townishness and quaintness is rather frustrating for the protagonist, but it is very entertaining to read. For instance, you turn around for 10 seconds and a sheep comes wandering across the crime scene, or the only pizza place that is still open only takes cash, and the next cash machine is 5 miles down the road, that kind of thing. And then, of course, the people that you meet in a place like this. And it's always humorous, but never twee and never condescending either, just very entertaining. What I did not like, on the other hand, is that there is too little psychological exploration of the implications of these new developments in this closed case and what that means for our protagonist, who was the detective that closed the case. And there is too little discussion of the protagonist's character and personality in general, because some of it is rather problematic. He seems to subscribe to the belief that the end justifies the means, and some of his actions and the way he treats people throughout the story are downright disturbing. And that is never really made an issue in the book. And that's very frustrating and unsatisfactory in the end. It's a bit of a shame, really, because the setting is so charming. I might try the second book in the series at some point and see if it doesn't get better. And my fourth book is the most recently released one in the bunch. It's A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson from 2019. And this is a fun YA sleuth story about a girl in her final year in secondary school who takes it into her head that she wants to write about a 5-year-old closed murder case from her small town. So 5 years before the events in this book, a high school girl from the small town went missing. And although her body was never found, she was declared dead when a few days later her boyfriend committed suicide, and on his body were found traces of her blood and her DNA, and in his car as well. And now, 5 years later, the protagonist Pippa's senior year project is initially only supposed to be a discussion of how the treatment that the case got in the media and in the public discourse affected the life of the families, especially the life of the boyfriend's family, his parents and his younger brother. But very soon Pippa becomes aware of some oddities and discrepancies in the transcripts of the interviews that she conducts with witnesses, and also in the transcripts of the police interviews from 5 years before. And then very soon her objective changes from just writing about the media treatment to instead proving the dead boy's innocence. Even though this is long for a YA novel, it's a very fast read, not least because the traditional third-person narrative is ever so often interrupted by transcripts of the interviews that Pippa conducts, and also just of her musings, like a journal of her investigation. In fact, I'd say that there's at least as much of that in the book as traditional third-person narrative, but it's very organic and it feels very well balanced. On the minus side, it got on my nerves with how full of cliches and stereotypes it was, beginning with the protagonist, who is a straight A student and therefore, of course, has a major stick up her ass and doesn't know how to party either. And when she tries, she only gets assaulted by one of those evil weed smoker fiends. Because, those are so famous for aggressive behavior everywhere. And then the novel's central issue, because it has an issue that it wants to talk about, it almost feels dated for a novel that was released in 2019. And not in the sense that it's not an issue anymore, but in the sense that it's been done to death. And at the end of the day, it's been done better and in a more layered and more original fashion too, in my opinion. So my overall verdict is that this was a fun read, but ultimately forgettable. So this brings us to the book that I'm currently reading. I'm currently more or less exactly in the middle of it. It's The Verdict by Nick Stone. This is a legal thriller or courtroom drama that's set in London, and the protagonist is a legal clerk working in a private law firm. And they are currently representing a very high-profile client in a very high-profile case. It's a multi-millionaire is accused of having murdered a young woman in a hotel suite. It turns out that the accused is actually a person from the protagonist's past. They used to be best friends and then had a falling out when the guy who later became a millionaire basically screwed the protagonist over completely and ruined his life for at least a decade. And now in the present, they both have the potential to ruin each other with the secrets that they know about each other. This is an interesting read, and I'm not sure what to think about it at the moment. For one, I'm almost exactly 50% in, and it still feels like we're in the middle of the exposition because very little progress has been made. But the main obstacle to my enjoyment of the book is that, unfortunately, this is first-person narration, and unfortunately the narrator's voice is rather boring. It's very competent, but rather bland, and there is nothing distinctive about it and nothing interesting. Then again, there is one thing that is absolutely genius. The novel begins with a prologue that is a statement of the accused man, the alleged murderer, about the events that took place on the night of the murder. And at the end of this statement, you, the reader, or at least I, was convinced of two things. A, he is an absolutely loathsome individual, and B, he is innocent. So even though I loathe the guy, and even though for the first half of the novel almost everybody else is absolutely convinced of his guilt, I want to see, and I expect to see, his innocence proven, because it doesn't seem to be the sort of novel that ends with a conviction of an innocent man. So it will be so interesting to see how they are going to prove his innocence, and to see what actually happened on the night of the murder, because the details of that are very much still in the dark. So even though I am bored in some respects, the novel is also very much a page turner, and on the whole, I am enjoying reading it. And yet still, of all the books that I talked about today, I'd still say that the Dave Brandstetter book, Fadeout by Joseph Hansen, is the most interesting one and the one that I would most widely recommend. So I hope this has been interesting and or illuminating for you. As always, I'd love to hear what you thought about these books that I talked about. In particular, I would be interested in hearing what you thought about the Maltese Falcon. I hope the new year has been treating you well so far, and I hope I'll see you very soon with another video. Bye!